There you go. It shouldn't be posted anywhere other than the IFSA page. So there you go, whenever you're ready.
All right. Let me share my screen. Okay, let me do this. Okay, well, I will get going if everyone can see my screen okay and hear me okay. So first, thanks for inviting me to speak. Thanks for the folks who have put this together. My name is Matt Kelly. I'm an assistant professor of natural resource management at Michigan Tech University in the College of Forest Resources and Environmental Science. I teach a couple of classes. I teach our forest and natural resource management class, as well as our senior capstone class, and that's how I know Greg. And I also occasionally teach an advanced timber harvesting class when we have enough students who are interested in taking it. So what I've been asked to do is talk a little bit about the logging sector and forest operations in Michigan, but I've kind of expanded that to include the Lake States because there's been a few coordinated surveys between Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and we're actually in the process of getting ready for the next iteration of that survey. So with that, I'll go into my talk, Logging in the Lake States, Trends and Challenges. So what I'll do for the talk today is I'll give some background on the logging sector and include and talk a lot about the data that we've collected from these surveys and some of the trends that we're seeing both in the Lake States and in Michigan, as well as in the US overall. And then I've left some slides at the end to talk a little bit about some of the innovations that we're seeing in Michigan in and around the region. And I really want to focus on as future foresters, sort of getting you to think about how your prescriptions and your management recommendations, how those affect logging firms, and making sure that they're actually viable from a logger's perspective. So first, a little bit about the big picture. I think everyone who's involved in forestry understands this, but it's really good to reinforce it. So what do logging firms do, and what's their role in the world of forestry and forest management? Well, first and foremost, they help landowners achieve their management objectives, and those could be as diverse as generating revenue and managing for high quality timber, to wildlife, to forest health. All those things a logger and their equipment can help bring to bear. They provide raw materials to wood products industry, and that's important, especially for rural economies. So loggers help contribute to rural economies and provide the resources that support all the products that we enjoy. And as always, we are reminded that these are renewable resources. And more as we look to wood to replace things like concrete and steel, especially in tall wood buildings, it's really important that we have a viable logging sector. And so they're this critical link in sustainable forest management, and they provide essential skills and services. And I bring that up because a lot of times loggers are asked to contract out or to build roads, to maybe do some, like I mentioned before, some wildlife habitat creation or food plots or recreational trails. So they're asked to do a lot of things sometimes above and beyond just harvesting trees. But they take on a huge financial risk. The equipment that they own is very capital intensive, costs a lot of money. It's not unusual for a single crew to have an investment of $500,000 or more just in the equipment. And so they're taking on this huge financial risk. And that's always something that as foresters, we need to keep in mind, because just because we put paint on a tree does not mean that a logger is willing to cut it. Okay, so the key here is to think about the logging capacity in a given region. And some of the fundamental questions that we need to think about are, one, is there currently enough logging capacity to meet the demand for harvesting? You know, what's the current number of firms, workers, what's the production that could be achieved given that logging sector? And then number two, will there be enough logging capacity in the future? And so we'll get a little bit into sort of the future of some of these firms in just a bit. And then three, what factors affect production positively and negatively? And certainly we see a lot around weather, especially here in the lake states. We go through, ideally logging would happen over the winter when soils are protected, but more and more we're having periods of warm up where there's suddenly a spike in temperatures, and we're in the 40s and 50s for a little bit in February, which is unusual. And sometimes those logging operations need to be shut down because the road system, which is normally frozen, is starting to loosen up and break up. And so weather is going to affect production. Also, the market itself, right now we do have low grade markets in Michigan for paper and pulp, though they're becoming strained. In other parts of the country where paper mills have closed or are in decline, they're having a real challenge trying to get rid of some of that low grade material, which gets back to how can you implement different types of silviculture if it's becoming a challenge to remove in a commercially viable way some of those small and less vigorous trees. Okay, some of the key metrics that we like to measure when we're thinking about the logging sector. The first is, for each firm, how much volume do you harvest in a given year? So their total annual volume harvested. And so we refer to that as their production. Then we also want to know how many logging firms are there. Again, we're trying to make sure that there's enough capacity. And then how many total number of logging employees. And that gets at sort of is the industry being consolidated or contracting? Is there a viable career for these folks who are coming through the ranks? So first, I want to point this article out to you if you haven't seen it. It's a really good review of a lot of the different types of logging sector surveys that have been conducted throughout the U.S. over the past 40 years or so. And so this is by some of my colleagues, Joseph Conrad and Dale Green, who are down at University of Georgia, as well as Patrick Heisel, who's at Clemson. And so they looked at a whole bunch of these studies through the years and categorized it. I've done some work on costs of best management practices, so there's some stuff in there about that. But it gives a really good kind of big picture view of some of the challenges and trends. And one of their conclusions is that there are just fewer logging firms today than there were 20 to 30 years ago. And there are also fewer logging employees too. And we can look at that from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that's what they did. And the question then becomes, well, if the logging sector is contracting, does that mean the production capacity is down, or is harvest production down? So let's look at some of those results. So this figure along the x-axis, we have our years starting in 1990 and going through 2016. And then on the left, this is the number of logging workers. And this y-axis on the left is relevant for this black line, which is the US. And then on the right, we have the number of logging workers for the state. So they're at two different scales. And so any colored line here, the red, blue, yellow, or green, you're looking at the right, and from the black, you're looking at the left. And so what we can see here is a very steady decline in number of workers over the years. And so in the US, we've gone from, let's see, about 88,000 down to maybe close to 55,000. So a significant drop. And we can see that in different states, that decline is a little bit different. In Michigan, it's not so bad. So Michigan is this dark green line here. And so it's been fairly consistent. But in Georgia and in, let's see, Georgia's blue, Oregon is red. You've seen a very steady decline. And then of course here, we see this really sharp drop, and that's around 2000, 2009, which is when the Great Recession occurred. So that's a little bit to be expected. And since that point, things have sort of stabilized. It's looking, actually, there's been an increase, probably because of all those, the market downturn and then the market upturn. And now things look to be a little bit more stable. And just zeroing in on some of that data. So here's Michigan over that period of time between 1990 and 2016. There's been a decline of 92 in the number of businesses, which is a 20% change. And then in workers, there's been a reduction of 84, which has only been a 5% change, which isn't, as the graph before indicated, isn't too significant of a change, but it is on the downward trend. In Minnesota, they've actually picked up some workers. And then in Wisconsin, they've seen a large decline, over 50% decline in the number of workers. So then the question is, well, does that affect production? You know, if we have less workers and less business firms, does that necessarily mean that less volume is being harvested from the woods? And the one thing to point out is that this is a very different time scale. So it goes up to 2013, 2014, but it starts much earlier. So you really have to look at it from around here, 1990. And you can see, as you know, think back to that other figure I showed you, there's been a steady decline in the US in terms of total number of workers. But here we've seen there's actually been, in terms of production, it's been pretty stable despite that decline. Of course, there was a decline again in 2008, the Great Recession hit, and everything just came to almost a screeching halt. And then there's been an uptick since then. And what this shows is both the production, you know, what's being removed from the US, as well as the consumption of round wood. And that gap right there indicates that we are importing wood from other countries. So we're not producing enough to meet the total consumption demand. And that's pretty typical. We do import other types of species and products. And so that's typically what we see, is there's a little bit of a gap there. But I think the question, it's hard to answer distinctly because of this 2008 dip. But by and large, it does seem like we're able to maintain a certain level of production despite the reduction in firms and workers. Here's another graph showing that. This is some work that I did back in 2015, looking at similar trends. And so these bars indicate the annual volume harvested in New York. And from, let's see, this starts in about 1999, goes through 2013. And the blue are the paid logging employees. And then the red is the logging firm. So there's been some decline in New York over the years, but the harvest volume per year has fluctuated, but it hasn't really come down too much. And so that tells me that despite some of these declines, the sector as a whole is still able to meet some pretty stable production. But we're seeing this consolidation. So if the same amount of volume is being harvested, or similar amounts of volume are being harvested by fewer and fewer number of loggers, then there's this sort of consolidation. And that's being driven by increased mechanization. So in the 80s and 90s, of course, there was much more hand felling, and more we're seeing firms invest in mechanized systems, cut to length, feller buncher systems. And with that comes increased productivity. And so you just don't need as many hand fellers because, you know, one feller buncher can do the work of 3 or 4 hand fellers. Another issue that's come up is the idea that some of these firms are having trouble finding qualified labor. And so there's just fewer young people who are willing to get into the logging profession. And so that's driving some of the consolidation. Other issues could be access to capital. You know, if you have a startup, if there's a young logger who wants to go out and start his or her own business, then they need to go to a bank and get some loans. and whether or not that bank is willing to provide those loans could be a source of constraint. And then competition. I'm going to show you some data in just a bit that shows that it's really hard for the little firms to compete. The bigger firms can have more competitive bids. They're in a position to maybe take some jobs that are at cost, or maybe even lose some money and still absorb it because they're so big. That's not always true for the little guy. Other drivers we saw in 2008, the Great Recession. And so as things get bad in the market, some of those low performing firms just fall out of the sector completely, and whatever production they were doing gets picked up by the bigger firms. And so that's a path for consolidation as well. And then finally, what we don't know is how is COVID-19 in this past year going to affect a lot of these regions in terms of their logging sector. In Michigan, it was early on stated that the forestry sector is considered a critical industry, and so they were allowed to continue to produce. And there's been indications that as people have been home in their homes, they've to keep themselves busy, or maybe they just realized they needed to do some upgrades to their house, that there has been some sort of renovation work. But there was a period of time where forestry was considered essential, but construction was not. And so there might be sort of a lag in terms of how that affects the industry overall. So there's a lot to be known and researched in terms of the effects of COVID. Okay, so let's get into some of the data. As I mentioned a few years back in 2017, I was sort of part of this group along with folks from Michigan State University and University of Minnesota and University of Wisconsin. And we developed a survey where we asked similar questions across the 3 states to get a sense of what's going on in the lake states as a whole, as opposed to just one state individually. So a lot of this is from Shivangi C., who this was her PhD dissertation work. And you can find the article that she was the lead author on in Journal of Forestry. This came out last year, 2020, titled "The Logging Sector in the Lake States of Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin: Status, Issues, and Opportunities." You can also go to this website. So this is put together by Mark Rickenbach at the University of Wisconsin. And it's a really great resource if you're interested more in this topic. He calls it the 2018 blogging logging. And so he's got different modules, and you can kind of click through the different topics and see some of the figures and results from this survey. All right, let's start with the annual harvest volume. As I mentioned before, that it's a key metric for determining sort of the status of a sector. And so what we see here is different firms have been categorized by their average annual harvest category. And so here on the left, we have smaller firms who are only producing 100 to 1,000 cords per year. And then all the way on the right, we have the larger firms who are producing more than 15,000 cords annually. And so those are going to be your big firms who have multiple crews, highly invested in their machines. And what we also find is that those larger companies are purchasing machines, running them for 3 to 5 years, and then trading them in. So they have very new equipment compared to some of these smaller operators who sometimes buy used equipment or just hold on to equipment for very long periods of time. And that might be part of the reason why they're low producing. That equipment tends to break down more often. So it's really hard to get on that cycle and have the capital and the means to constantly replace these pieces of equipment. But that's really what separates some of these larger companies from the smaller companies is their size, the number of crews, and their willingness to invest in brand new equipment. And so what we see here is that this line here, this green line, indicates the percent of harvest volume, which is on the right-hand side. And then these are the percent of businesses in these different categories. And you can see that 16% of all businesses that were surveyed are in this very large category, more than 15,000 cords. And even though they're only 16%, they're producing 63% of the annual harvest volume. So again, the idea of consolidation, you have very few firms who are producing most of the volume. And this is not a new trend. We've seen this in past studies. So this is from Minnesota a few years back prior to the current survey. And it was the same thing here. Their category was greater than 20,000 cords. And again, you see, close to 60% of the total volume in the state of Minnesota was being produced by 30% of the firms. So let's pivot and talk a little bit about where these firms are sourcing their production. And so one of the questions that was asked in the survey was, where do you source your production from? And the options were private woodlands, or what we might consider non-industrial private forest landowners, industrial forests, state forests, county forests, and federal forests. So you have two private landowner types, private woodlands and industrial, and then three public landowner types. And what we can see here is, especially in Michigan and Wisconsin, the plurality, if not the majority, of production is coming from these non-industrial private landowners, or sometimes referred to as family forest owners. And that could be a challenge in and of itself, because we know that those folks have a wide variety of interests and reasons for owning their land, and it's not always for timber production. And in fact, a lot of the surveys on landowners indicate that timber production and sort of that kind of active management approach is a pretty low priority, much lower than things like protecting nature, or having a place to recreate, or providing habitat for wildlife. But yet they still harvest, and so they're an important piece of this industry. Industrial forests, of course, we know that they're going to be willing to harvest, and so that should be a pretty stable source. In Wisconsin, very little of the production comes from industrial forests, but in Michigan and Minnesota, a sizable chunk. And then you have your public lands. State forests are pretty consistent in terms of their willingness to harvest, as are county forests, and especially in Wisconsin. And the federal forests kind of go back and forth depending on sort of public opinion, or what might be going on in any given year or under any given administration. Here's a closer look at the Wisconsin data for timber supply. And this shows, again, categorized by the level of production that a firm does in a given year. So if your smaller firms who are producing up to 1,000 cords, and then again, your larger firms who are producing over 15,000 cords. And what we can see is that the reliance on these woodland owners, or non-industrial private landowners, is much greater for these smaller firms. They're servicing those landowners at a greater proportion than these larger firms. These larger firms are still getting a lot of their production from those landowners, but they're relying more on county and state and national and corporate landowners, which to me indicates that having these small logging firms is really critical for small landowners. If that's sort of the niche that they find themselves in, if we see that there's going to be more consolidation in less logging firms at that smaller level, what does that mean for some of these non-industrial private forest landowners? Will they be able to get their harvests cut? So that remains to be seen. And we know that non-industrial private forest owners are really important in the region and in the US overall. They own 36% of all forest land in the US. And then in Michigan, they own about 50% of all productive forest land. So making sure that they have access to logging firms is really important. All right, so let's think about the future of these firms. What are some of the things that that we need to be concerned about, or just on the watch for? And the first one is the age of the business owner. And so this is some data, again, from Wisconsin, where they've done repeated surveys. And in 2003, you see the results in blue, 2010 in red, and then 2016, the most recent one in green. And what you're seeing here is that these business owners are getting older, which shouldn't surprise anyone. That's what happens as time goes by. We all age. And so, in 2003, you had much higher components of your 35 to 44-year-old aged owners and 25 to 34. So you have younger owners. And now in 2016, those folks have grown up and now they're in this sort of nearing retirement age, right? This green bar here. So between 55 and over, you're seeing sort of a large portion of owners. So that gets at the question, what's going to happen in the next 5 years in terms of, will there be these businesses or will there be new businesses? And so that was one of the questions that was asked in the survey. Will you, in the next 5 years, do you plan on being in business? So here we have the percentage of owners who responded to the survey who indicated that they would not be in business in 5 years. And so overall, and this again is Wisconsin, overall, about 26% of all businesses that were surveyed said that they did not expect to be in business. And when you look at that divided by the different categories, over 50% are in that very small production category, and then it tapers down. And so again, thinking about how much these smaller firms service smaller landowners, it's a little bit of a concern. Again, what's going to happen if they go out of business? Either a smaller company will replace them, or that extra production will get scooped up by these larger businesses. Whether or not those larger businesses are willing to cut, a 10 or 15 acre harvest on, the back 40 remains to be seen. Here's some of the results from Michigan. So 24% of responding logging firms did not expect to remain in business in 5 years. And then some of the reasons that they provided, 77% said that they were just getting old and just intended to retire. And they didn't have really any plan to pass the business on. 13% indicated that the reason was that it was just no longer profitable. As I mentioned before, logging is a very high cost business. And so if they can't make the payments on their machines as well as enough revenue to replace those machines in a certain amount of years, the depreciation, and also pay themselves and their employees, then they just close and they just go under. Other reasons, questionable markets. And I talked about low grade and how that's always a lot of uncertainty around those markets. Labor issues, where's the next generation of trained and responsible and trustworthy loggers? Where are they coming from? They can't get financing. That gets into the capital and the loans. And then a lot of that just sort of kind of sums up to that they're not enjoying it anymore. And then we asked, what do you plan on doing, as you think about retirement or as you close the business? And so this gets at the idea of firm succession. And so we asked, who's going to take over your business, if anyone, when you retire, when you close. 39% of respondents in Michigan said that they were going to hand it off to a family member. So son, daughter, sibling, nephew. 4% said that they would hand it off to a current employee or a subcontractor. Interestingly, 22% said they had no idea, and 33% have no plans to pass it on at all. So again, thinking about the future capacity, this is a little concerning, and again, thinking about consolidation, those bigger firms, are they going to be able to service these small landowners? There's a lot of questions around that. All right, so focusing in on where, the idea that some people think that there's a problem with recruiting new loggers into the sector. One of the questions that kind of gets at that is, why did the current loggers who are being surveyed, why did they get into this business in the first place? And so this is a list of important or potential factors, and they were asked to rate it on an importance scale. And so here it is, the most important factor why why they think that someone would get into the business is because there's a sense of independence. After that, they enjoy working outdoors. There's a sense of accomplishment. It's challenging. So all this gets at sort of the conditions of the work itself. They enjoy the challenge. They enjoy being outside. They enjoy that sense of accomplishment. Down here, you see what's not really important. And the first one is the very least important is that it pays well. And that's pretty consistent in all these surveys, is that they don't get paid a ton of money. You know, this is not Jeff Bezos, Amazon money. This is enough to make a living, certainly, but at a lot of upfront cost. There's also concerns that it's not really respected. So they never thought that was really an important reason why they got into the business anyway. But again, it's all about the type of work and the independence and being outdoors, and it's less about how well it pays. And then another question related to that: which factors encourage or discourage entry of new people into the logging business? And again, it's work environment they thought was important in terms of, or at least the highest important. Note that 3 is neither encourages or discourages, but a lot of these factors they thought was discouraging for new people to enter the business. So availability of competing jobs, the skills necessary, the prestige associated. They thought that wasn't really a prestigious career, and people might be discouraged for that reason. Physical demands of the job, even in the machines, I will say that it is physically demanding. You know, they have to change hoses and, you know, very cold weather, and then just sitting in a machine, being jostled around all day is demanding. Pay or wages is discouraging. Health of the logging industry, they said, is discouraging, and then benefits packages is very discouraging. So there are real challenges in terms of getting people to enter this profession as new loggers. And I don't think I have the results here, but in past studies, we've seen that logging owners, you know, when asked, you know, would you want your kid or your child or your relatives to enter into this business? A lot of them say no. They want their kids to go into a different business or go get an education and do something else. And so that becomes a real problem, especially when we see that one of the reasons that people get into the work in the first place is because they come from a family of loggers. All right, so one of the reasons that we saw people leaving the business or the sector was inability to make profits, or what we just saw before, low pay. So here's some results in Wisconsin, again, over time, about how these different businesses view the profitability of their business. So focusing just on 2016, the green, we saw that it was pretty positive. It was actually, this is better than I was expecting. About 39 to 40% thought that the profitability was good or excellent in 2016, which is much better than 2010. Again, that's right off the heels of the Great Recession. So that's not too surprising that in 2010 things were poor or very poor or at least break even. But it's important to keep profitability in mind. And a lot of times, you know, firms have to take jobs that they're going to lose money on just to keep the wheels rolling and to make sure that they're getting some cash flow to pay their employees so that their employees don't leave, even if it's at a loss. Or sometimes they have to take a job that they know it's just going to be break even. There's no profit to be made. But again, they have to keep the wheels rolling, keep the paychecks flowing. Here's profitability in Michigan. And so 44% of the respondents indicated that they operated at their full capacity, indicating that, you know, at their full capacity, this is what their profitability will be. But note that there is room for more production. So if only 44% of respondents are indicating that they're operating at their full capacity, that means that there are a lot of firms out there who feel like they could produce more, but there are some constraints. And those constraints, again, could be there's just not enough harvest sales being put up, or they can't compete for those bids, or the market's turned, or there's been some issues with weather that made it so that they couldn't produce as much as they thought they could have. And so what are the barriers to profitability or maximizing production? As I mentioned, mill prices, stumpage prices. So if stumpage prices are high, some of those smaller firms may not be able to be competitive in the bidding process. A lot of these firms have high operating costs. Operating costs being, paying their workers, those kind of things. Insurance costs, competition for stumpage. Competition is going to drive up those stumpage prices. Attracting or hiring employees, we mentioned that before. Equipment replacement, and so especially firms that are running much older machines, harvesters, skidders, those are gonna break down more often, or even when they are running, they're just less productive because they don't have all the bells and whistles and modern technology to make them faster and more productive. And so that becomes an issue: is are they going to hold on to their existing fleet of machines, or are they going to invest in replacement? Public stumpage available. Again, as I mentioned, sometimes national forests, they go through these periods where they're not doing a lot of sales, and that really frustrates the logging community. Retaining employees. And if you're going through periods of downturn or the market's bad, a lot of times loggers, because they are skilled, and in terms of machine operators, they can easily hop over to the construction industry and start, doing land clearing, running a dozer, for a completely different industry, because they'll go where the paycheck is best. And then small contracts from mills for products. So this is getting at not just the bidding process on stumpage, but sometimes the mill will purchase a timber sale and then contract out to the loggers, and the loggers often aren't in a really good position to negotiate those contract rates, so that becomes a challenge. Okay, so what kind of equipment is being run within these 3 states? So this is the percent of annual production by felling method. And so we're seeing, again, very few or relatively few firms are running hand felling systems. And so in Michigan, 10% of the total production is done by hand felling using a chainsaw. In Minnesota, it's only 2%. In Wisconsin, it's 15%. Harvesters and processors as part of a cut to length system. Those are real popular in Michigan and Wisconsin. We see them all over the place. Any job that you go to in the UP, chances are you're likely to see this configuration. In Minnesota, they do rely more on the feller buncher system. So a feller buncher, skidder, and then some kind of slasher at the landing. So 74% of the production in Minnesota is coming from a feller buncher system, whereas the majority of production is coming from these harvester processor cut to length systems in Michigan and Wisconsin. And so what we're seeing here is, again, most firms are becoming fully mechanized. As you can imagine, and folks in Canada can probably appreciate, is we get a lot of snow here. We get a lot of lake effect. And so just the idea of walking through the woods, cutting trees with a chainsaw in the middle of winter is a real challenge. So we've seen a quick move to fully mechanized. And the other thing to know is that we have a Ponce sort of outpost in northern Wisconsin. So they do a lot of business around here, and having that North American headquarters for Ponce close by, drives some of the market for these machines. So we have a lot of cut to length systems because Ponce only does cut to length. But I just want to point out that there's some implications for biomass harvesting with cut to length. So there's a lot of interest in replacing fossil fuels with renewable biomass for energy production. And if that were to happen in a much larger scale, we might be poorly aligned in terms of the type of equipment that's currently being used. And so if you think about where a lot of the biomass will come from, it'll generally come from tops and limbs. And how a harvester works is it'll buck those trees right there in the woods and leave the tops and limbs on the forest floor, or they'll move it in front of the machine to act as a mat for protecting soils. And that's just how those machines work. So now you have all this slash left on the floor, the logs being moved out by the forwarder. And how do you go back and collect some of those tops and limbs with this kind of equipment? It's really could be a challenge if the biomass markets really take off in Wisconsin and Michigan. In Minnesota, with a feller buncher system, well, they're moving those whole trees out to a landing where they're delimbed either through a pull through delimber or maybe even a stroke delimber. And so a lot of that slash just gets piled up at the landing anyway. And so it's much easier to then move from that slash pile on the landing into a chipper and then onto a truck and over to the biomass plant. So I just want to point that out because as we look into the future and a lot of people are interested in energy, the type of logging equipment is going to either be well suited or poorly suited for those types of products. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some of the innovations and approaches I've seen here in Michigan that are unique. And the first one, I started hearing about this a couple of years ago, and I actually went out to a site and saw it, is that you have firms or crews who are running a feller buncher in front of a harvester or sometimes referred to as a processor, and then followed by a forwarder. So you have these three large pieces of equipment. And basically the feller buncher is felling the tree, the harvester comes by, delimbs it, cuts it into logs of different lengths, and then the forwarder comes by and picks it up and brings it out to the road or to the landing, which is highly unusual. Typically, you'll see a harvester forwarder system will cut to length, or you'll do a feller buncher with a grapple skidder or a chain skidder, or a cable skidder rather. But this combination of equipment was really surprising to me just because there's the high cost of each one of those pieces of equipment. Each one of those can easily be, $250,000 or more. And so you're looking at a system that could be close to $1 million, if not more, to move wood out of the forest. On the flip side, they're extremely productive. Okay, so your harvester is no longer having to search out and find the trees to fell that are marked with paint. That's your feller buncher. They're just coming around where they see trees that are felled and moving, processing them into logs. So it's extremely productive. And so when you think about logging costs, it's really important to think of it in terms of dollars per volume of production. So dollars per MBF or dollars per cord. And if they can make that work, it could be very profitable for them. But again, there's a lot of upfront costs tied into those different pieces of equipment. Other innovations that we see, and I'm sure a lot of you have learned about in your courses, is the ideas of close to nature silviculture, or Jerry Franklin out west talks about it as ecological forestry, or all these things that we do that are sort of a new approach from your standard sort of silvicultural prescriptions. So things like variable density thinning, where you might have certain areas that are thinned to a lower residual basal area versus other areas that are kept rather dense. Things like site preparation, and then this other one that I'll talk about in a little bit, artificial tip-ups, which are meant to mimic sort of wind throw. And one of the things that we've found, or that I've seen studies look at, is sort of the challenges from the operator's perspective when you're having to work in a stand that has some of these prescriptions to it. So even when it's a light thinning, they have to search around for the trees. Sometimes it's snowing, it becomes difficult. When you compare that to a clear cut or a shelter wood, something that is just easier just to go and grab trees and cut them down. Artificial tip ups, like I mentioned, I'll talk about that in a bit. But these prescriptions really affect operability in a number of ways. Like I mentioned, searching for marked trees can be kind of problematic. If you're leaving pockets of sort of untouched trees and then pockets of patches, you're leaving it up to the logger to go out and find those things, and that takes time and concentration. Other types of prescriptions, if you're just marking really lightly, there's going to be a low volume per acre, and that's going to affect the willingness of the logger to even bid on that job, because like I mentioned, you got to think in terms of dollars per production unit, and if it's low volume per acre, they're spending a lot of time with their machines to produce relatively little volume. And then, of course, the wear and tear in the machines is a direct output of time spent in the woods. And I'm going to talk about that in terms of artificial tip-ups right now. So this was a sort of a little bit of a study that was done here on the Michigan Tech Ford Forest. And the prescription was for the logger using their processor or harvester processor machine to basically grab some trees and rip them out of the ground. Right? Instead of just cutting them at the base, they're going to push them over to mimic wind disturbance or wind throw. And the purpose of that treatment was to help regenerate certain species like yellow birch that really benefit from having exposed mineral soils. And so we're creating pit and mound topography, again, which you're changing the microsite conditions. And so they wanted to try this out. And so me and Jim Schmier, a colleague of mine, decided, hey, let's go out and do a time and motion study to see how this is going to affect the operation itself. Again, this is what we would consider sort of a close to nature kind of approach to silviculture, where they're trying to mimic something that happens naturally. So hopefully this comes through. This is a video that I took while out on the job site, and it's of a harvester grabbing a tree and tipping it over, and you'll see how I consider the cycle time. Oh, that didn't work. Let's go back. All right, so hopefully you're seeing this. So the harvesting head is at the tree, and so that's when I would start my stopwatch. And then he starts to push on it. Sometimes this one went pretty easily, but a lot of times he's got to go back and forth a few times to break the root system. And then boom, he rips it right out of the ground. So you can see the root ball, and you see him lay it down, move it in position, and then he'll cut the log and still use the log for production. So that becomes the end of my cycle time. The root ball is cut, the tree is felled, and now it's ready to be processed into logs. And so he moves it over, rolls it through the rollers, and then just starts cutting it to 8-foot logs. That's our typical length here in Michigan. So that's what we did. We timed that, and we compared that to sort of your normal felling process. Get back to. Oh. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so we also went out and measured sort of, did he create the conditions that we were trying to emulate in terms of these pit and mounds? I won't go through the stats. I just wanted to give you these pictures of what it actually looks like. Right? So at the end of that treatment, we have all these root balls that are turned over, and they look like this. So it's not your typical wind-thrown tree where you have that root plate that's totally vertical because the weight of the tree itself is keeping it in that vertical position. Here, because we cut the tree off from the stump, those tend to look a little bit different. So they're not vertically aligned. They're more just sort of plucked out of the ground and positioned sort of next to where it was once living and standing. And it does successfully create these pits, which could, again, provide good microhabitat for salamanders or other sorts of critters. But again, here's that mineral soil that we're trying to expose to get some regeneration of other species. So in that sense, it did do its job in terms of creating something that sort of resembled natural wind throw. and we can argue about that. But our question was more, well, what did this do in terms of the cycle time for the operator? And so when we looked at the companion or just the regular cut trees of similar diameters, and these are all mostly sugar maple, I should mention, the cycle time to just cut a tree, put it on the ground, and get it ready to process was 8.65 seconds. When we compare that with the time required to rip those trees and tip them over, that required on average 27.21 seconds. So we're talking about, about 19-second difference, and these were significantly different. And it doesn't sound like much, but if you apply that over sort of, an entire treatment. So here we had about 900 tip-up trees that were marked for tip-up. And if you apply that, roughly 19 seconds per tree over those 900 trees, you're talking about 4.5 or close to 5 more hours of machine runtime to complete those tip-ups. So, not quite a day, but certainly it could prevent that logger from moving on to the next job. But more important, I think, than the time study results is, and we heard this from the loggers themselves, the wear and tear that was being done to the machine by pulling those trees out of the ground in that way. And we also talked to some of the engineers at Ponce, and it was a unanimous sort of message that these machines are not designed to do that. They're designed to cut the tree and then to lower that tree to the ground, not to tear it out of the ground like we were having them do it. So that was a real consideration, and unfortunately, we didn't measure for that. But I think just intuitively, we can all agree that doing a tip up with a harvester is going to have much more wear and tear on a machine than just normal felling. And so that really needs to be considered. And for that reason, I would not recommend this at all. There are other ways to create tip and mound topography and expose mineral soil. We don't need to have this burden be placed on the loggers when they have such a high cost business that they're trying to run as is. Right, so these machines are not designed to do this, and so please think carefully before you prescribe a treatment that includes this kind of thing. Okay, so that's sort of at the end of my talk. A few things I want to summarize. Again, a healthy logging sector is really important, and so we need them, and we need them to thrive into the future. The sector is experiencing some contraction and consolidation, and that will likely continue. And again, there's some questions around, losing those small firms and what that means for those private woodland owners or non-industrial private forest owners. Some of the key issues are recruiting new loggers and business owners. And we saw from the survey results that a lot of these businesses don't have a plan for succession. And then ensuring that loggers are profitable, and not just mills and landowners. A lot of times these loggers are squeezed between the landowner who has the supply that they need to cut and the mill who's willing to pay a certain price. And so they're really in a tough position in the middle of those two forces. And so on the landowner side, we have a lot of policies in terms of cost share, in terms of tax incentives that incentivize landowners to manage their land actively. But we don't really have too much for loggers. So keep that in mind. And also keep your loggers in mind when writing your prescriptions. Again, just because you put paint on a tree doesn't mean a logger will be willing to cut it. And so that gets at the art and science of forestry. You have to understand a logger's perspective and what their machines can and can't do, and whether or not a timber sale that you're marking is going to be commercially viable. Really important. So with that concludes my talk, and I'll invite anyone to ask a question or make a comment.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Kelly. That was super interesting, especially for someone that's not too familiar with how business is being done south of the Great Lakes.
Sure.
Yeah, it sure was interesting. I may have a question. You mentioned that there was an issue with big companies, or I could say big logging companies that weren't always or that were reluctant to work into smaller areas
Mhm.
with smaller landowners. I was wondering if it was common practice for those small landowners to come together and have multiple lots being managed by one company. I'm just putting this out there because I know it's something that's being put into fashion in Quebec. So I was wondering if that's a trend that you were seeing.
Um, yeah, so there's been a lot of interest in kind of cooperative management across property lines. You see that a little bit in terms of working with a consulting forester. So if there's one consulting forester who represents or manages, multiple private landowners' woodlots, sometimes they have that perspective where they can see that the potential benefit to kind of running harvests at the same time. And that person might then be able to intervene and say, hey, this person who's right down the street from you is going to do a harvest. The only way we're going to get your woodlot harvested is by combining the two. And it'll be up to the consulting forester at that point to figure out, how the pay gets divvied up. In terms of landowners doing it themselves and coming together, there's a lot of hope, but we don't see it too much. Where we do see landowners coming together and managing, there's been some evidence in the West, and it's all related to fire. So that they're willing to come together and say, well, let's all do some fuels management, because if I manage my fuels and remove a bunch of my fuels, well, it only works if you also do it too. And so there's that incentive to protect their forest, to do some fuels management. There's also been some, this is more like people who live on their woodlots, some potential cooperation around invasive species, where, again, similar to fire, it only really helps if I remove if I'm controlling my invasive species, if you do it too, because once mine are gone, they're just going to move in from your property. So that's one of those things that there's a lot of benefit. But in terms of getting the economy of scale, which is really what we're talking about, which is the reluctance to do these small harvests, is that, the logging crew is there for a day or two, and then they have to spend a day moving all the equipment, and the moving costs to move that stuff with the low boys, and the downtime from production is a cost, especially in the winter when every day matters. They don't want to spend time moving in and moving out. They just want to keep cutting as much as they can. But yeah, it's a good question. It would be great if we had more cooperation with private landowners. Some places it might work better than others, I guess I'd say. And I think the consulting forester really is a driver of that.
Very interesting. Thank you. I don't see any questions in the chat. Of course, feel free to open your mics if you have any questions.
Yeah, I actually had one. First, thanks so much for joining us. It's really cool to hear about other regions. All my work focuses on the Western US, with the caveat that I'm a landscape ecologist, not a forester, so it's not as if I know anything about logging in the Western US either. But I guess my question more has to do with, I was seeing a lot of parallels between the issues you were talking about and a lot of the issues faced by the agricultural sector, where you have increased consolidation and production costs squeezing profits and squeezing young farmers and loggers out of the business. And I guess some of the answer to that has been focus on small farm programs and local economies. And I was wondering if there are any analogous programs in your region, or like federal or state supports for that kind of work.
There are for landowners. I'd say there's much more available for landowners. So for instance, we have forest tax policies that reduce the tax burden for landowners so that they're not being taxed at the highest and best rate, which is usually to convert your forest to condos or to a Walmart or something like that. They tend to tax at that. And so those programs say, no, we're going to keep it as forest. We're going to have a management plan, and we're not going to develop it or convert it. And similarly, there's the NRCS has their EQIP, their Environmental Quality Incentive Program, which will pay landowners to do things like best management practices, and it's for ag land too. Having a riparian buffer, doing a proper bridge, culverts. There's some programs throughout the country, and it's usually at a state level, that do sort of like a skidder bridge loan program. So there might be an NGO or a state agency that just builds a bunch of skidder bridges, and because they want you to use them and not drive your equipment through streams, and they understand the cost of building them yourselves, they'll just have those sort of stationed around a region. And as long as a logger kind of makes an inquiry and notifies that they want to use it, those are often available to them. Where I did my research for my master's was in New York, and specifically in the area that provides the water source for New York City. So the Catskill Mountains, which is about 2 hours north of New York City, and it's rural, it's mountainous, there's a lot of public land. In that area, because water quality is so important, they actually pay loggers, to do BMPs. And so if a logger does finishes a harvest, they'll just go and verify how many water bars were put in, and they'll pay them $50 a water bar. What we found though is that some of the loggers say, well, that kind of distorts the market a little bit, because if you're within the watershed, then people are pricing their sales accordingly, knowing that you're going to get payment back from that NGO for your water bars. If you're outside of the watershed, you don't get that reimbursement. And so it's really hard for them to be able to bid on that side of the line, knowing that they have to pay for their own water bars, where on this side of the line, they're bidding knowing that they're going to get reimbursed. So when it's not sort of ubiquitous, it does create sort of these marginal effects. But yeah, there's not a lot for loggers. I mean, there's training and they actually have to pay for it, but by going through the training, it opens up markets for them to work on certified land. But again, that's more of a burden that they have to go through.
Gotcha, thanks.
Sure.
I actually do have one more question, but if somebody else has one, they can hop in. But something we've been hearing more and more about out here is cross-laminated timber in addition to biofuels as an up-and-coming market for this stuff. And I was wondering if the same is true around the Great Lakes.
Yeah, I have a colleague, Mark Rudnicki, who actually they milled some of their own wood and tried to do some cross-laminated timber panels with hardwood, like low-grade hardwood, because we have a lot of hardwood. We do have red pine and jack pine, also some white pine, but we do have plenty of hardwood, and we have low grade. And so that was something that they experimented with just to see what it would take to do. And he's tried very hard to get, I think it's Smartlam, that's the company that is in Montana that is expanding, to get plants here in the UP. So yeah, and I know in Michigan State University, they've just either finished or are in the process of finishing their first sort of tall wood building, one of their on-campus structures. We're trying to do the same here at Michigan Tech. We have a new human health building that's supposed to go up, and we're keeping our fingers crossed that they'll put forward a plan for using cross-laminated timber or these tall wood building structures. So yeah, we need more markets. And even when I talk to wildlife biologists who want to see more early successional habitat or young forests or diversity. So as a landscape ecologist, you're probably interested in the patterns across the landscape. And a lot of places in the Northeast, there's just a sort of a homogeneous age structure. And so the wildlifers really want more grassland, more young forests, but they completely recognize that you can't do that unless it's commercially viable to get that material out of the woods. And so that's why these markets are so important.
Awesome, thanks.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a thought about the close in nature silviculture that you were talking about earlier. And it seems that there's a lot of hurdles, like the type of machinery and the wear and tear that it puts on those machines, and as well as the time it takes the cycle time for falling a tree. And so I'm wondering, is there any incentive programs or certified land type of things that would then motivate foresters to provide that kind of prescription that translates to something that accommodates for those higher production costs, essentially?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if there are any incentives at that specific issue. Again, it gets nuanced. So when you create policy, it has to be sort of like this big chunky thing where it's, we're going to tax you because you're a forest and not a Walmart. What we're talking about is really nuanced, like these slivers of forestry. So you mentioned certification. Those standards are pretty robust in terms of what they don't want to see, and not necessarily what they want to see. I mean, they do want to see, green up adjacency, those kind of things.
Yeah.
But they're really easy to measure. It's sort of, if an auditor goes out onto a site, they can say, there's a problem with the water quality right here. I can measure it. I can note it down. Or you don't have the required green up adjacency. I can note it. Or you didn't account for, this raptor nest, and now I see it's down the ground because you cut down the tree. Those things are easy to measure. So you really need those indicators. And when you talk about some of the close to nature stuff, it's hard to measure these. It would be great. It would be great if markets reflected the reality of all the benefits that are being provided, but they just don't always. And so, yeah, I hope that gives you some insight. I don't think I answered your question directly, but I don't know of any incentive programs that say if you do variable density thinning or these kind of things, you'll get paid more.
Yeah, no, that definitely answers my question. I think a big challenge with implementing those on a larger scale, or for those to become more common, there is the hurdle of how do you measure the benefits that come from, providing salamander habitats and so on.
Right.
In forestry practices. So
yeah, and then we get into whole ecosystem services valuation literature, which is super complicated. But I mean, keep in mind too that you're talking about something that's so interesting and important in a lot of ways. But at the same time, we have landowners and loggers out there who are just high grading everything. So how do you at least get them away from high grading? We have to move them from here to here before we can move them from here to here. So
yeah, thank you.
Sure.
All right, and if there are no more questions, I'll just go ahead and plug in a little question from what you just said. Are there any added values coming with those certifications from the landowner's perspective, or is it all the same on the market and it's just then a legal issue of whether the wood is certified or not?
Yeah, so there's been some research of colleagues, Francisco Aguilar, if you're interested in that question, you can look up some of his work, asking just that question, are these certification programs adding premiums to the landowner in terms of how much they get paid and maybe even to the logger? And by and large, the answer is no. It's not really making it more valuable. What it is making it, what's happening is that it just gives them greater market share, because there are certain retailers that are only going to buy certified wood. And so you have to make sure that you're certified if you want to be able to sell to those mills or to those retail outlets. And how that trickles down to the logger is then the logger needs to go through the SFI certified training system to be able to, especially for certification systems that are the chain of custody, which means that along each node in that supply chain, it has to be certified from the landowner to the logger to the mill. And having those loggers be certified is really important for that kind of certification. So from a logger's perspective, they do it because a lot of the state owned land is certified, and so and they want certified loggers. And so just again, it's more of an access to markets and to access to be able to cut on certain lands. But yeah, they're not really seeing much of a price increase, unfortunately.
I see. Well, once again, thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks for having me, everybody.
Yeah, that was very interesting.
Good. Yeah. If anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to email me. Yep. Otherwise, I have to go. My kids are doing an Easter egg hunt, so I can't stay. But have a great rest of the day, and thanks again.
Yeah, thank you very much for spending your Sunday morning here.
Sure, no problem.
Really appreciate it.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Well, then, Liz, I think the mic is all yours if you want to go ahead.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. Kind of want to see your guys' faces, but I only have one monitor. Okay, so thank you so much to the organizers for putting this on. I think it's so important that we remain connected, especially during these super challenging times. And it's not easy to host such an event, but especially now. So yeah, good on you guys again for putting this on, and I'm thrilled to be here and share some time with you and speak about something that's really passionate to me, silviculture in British Columbia. So I'm really grateful to live, work, and play on the traditional territory of the Lheidli people, the First Nations here in Prince George, British Columbia. So geographically, I'm going to show you like 5 maps coming up here. But geographically, we're sort of in the middle of the province here. And just to touch on a few points that Matt Kelly brought up in his presentation there, we have a pretty similar situation in BC with a lot of constraints and consolidations going on. A lot of the mills are closing, there's less logging operations, and this is all kind of coming down the pipe from just a reduction in harvesting from the mountain pine beetle epidemic. So although it's a lot of doom and gloom and the media is sort of presenting it in a really negative fashion, within the forestry realm, we've sort of known this is coming. You know, we ramped up to deal with mountain pine beetle, and now we're sort of ramping down. So there are a lot of challenges for sure. And so, yeah, that's interesting going on with our markets and industry. And I think Matt mentioned this as well. With COVID-19, our industry, forestry, was declared to be an essential workforce. So we full steam ahead our planting season last year. It was sort of a gong show to figure out, you know, new health orders coming out every week and trying to figure out what our industrial camps would look like. But yeah, I think the province, the whole country really, we did really well. There were no COVID cases in any tree planting camp across the province, and I think across other regions of Canada and America as well. So, I mean, that's a huge success. And so going into this season, I feel like we really have to celebrate that success, that we really forged the path there for tree planting. So I was really, really proud to be part of that. And this year in the Prince George and Mackenzie area alone, we're planting like 10 million trees. So we're right out of the gates going at it again. So I'm pretty excited for this field season, even though we're currently in a 3rd stage of a lockdown, but we're not going to talk about that. Today we're going to talk about silviculture in BC, so the Amanika and the Caribou regions. This photo in the background here, this is a really classic sort of cut block in BC. You see the aspen in the background, the retention, Populus tremuloides. You've got some subalpine fir in here, or balsam fir as we call it for some reason, Abies lasiocarpa. And then we've got the lodgepole pine here in the front, in the foreground, and then all this vegetation, mostly fireweed and some other herbaceous stuff. So we'll just dive right in here to all my maps. This map is from the First Peoples Culture Council. So you can see we're sort of looking at the Pacific Northwest generally. And these are all the traditional territories of the First Nations. And so we are looking at the Dekelf First territory in here, this green blob right in the center of the province. So you can see Quesnel, Prince George is just up here a little bit. So that's sort of the area that I operate in. And I want to bring this up because it's quite important. These peoples have different uses and practices on these lands, and some of these might have special interests that have to do with silviculture. So for example, the McLeod Lake Indian Band, which is about 2 hours north of Prince George, their pest management plan that they developed does not allow the use of herbicide. So that has to do with brush control and reforestation for us. So it's just important to point out that there's going to be some different management strategies based on traditional peoples using their land. So this is another map of BC, and I wanted to highlight the difference between crown land versus private land. So I think 98 point something percent of BC is crown land, meaning it's public land. So we as forest professionals really have to consider all public interests on the land base when we're conducting forestry activities. And here's another map of BC, and this is broken up into all of our forestry regions. So again, I'm kind of coming at you from right here in Prince George. The Amanika is mostly where I operate, down into this region here. And the Caribou is this warmer, drier region to the south. So Quesnel, Williams Lake. And even smaller still, here's really my bubble. This is this whole area is the Prince George timber supply area. So big chunk right in the middle of the forest, or of the province, excuse me. It's one of the biggest forest operation areas in the province. And so again, this Prince George area, the coral orange color, and there's two white blobs in there, TFL 30 and TFL 53. TFL just stands for timber farm license. So there's some slightly different management strategies for those areas. The licensees have a longer term. I think it's 25 years and it's renewed, or maybe it's 99 years renewed. Anyways, we're not getting into 10 years either, because that is just a whole other talk. But I just wanted to give you some context for sort of where we operate up here in Prince George. And this is just sort of this may be slightly out of date, but I like this map because it really shows, okay, here's the total area of BC, the productive forest land, currently the entire timber harvesting land base, and then annually what we actually harvest. So the timber supply is analyzed every 5 years. And so every 5 years, licensees get however much they are allowed to cut. And so then they have the 5 years to sort of cut that to their, however they see fit. So my silviculture journey started at very humble beginnings, tree planting. I planted in northern BC, sort of up in the Bear Lake area mostly, a bit in Alberta and stuff too, but Bear Lake is about an hour and a half sort of north and west of Prince George. And this tree planting, I mean, it's the best and the worst, but it really provided some really good foundation for me for silviculture, such as some species identification, microsite selection, and ecology. So the photo on the left, happy little tree planted in some nice mineral soil. Its little lateral branches are exposed and not completely buried. It's got a little bit of protection from the stuff here, nice obstacle plant. So it's a happy little tree. The tree on the right, I don't even know if you can see it, it's drowning. Trees don't like that. Don't plant trees in water, that's bad. And so then I went on to do some silviculture surveys on Vancouver Island, where I'm from. And this photo is of a pretty classic cut block on the island. So really steep slopes, lots of herbaceous brush competition, and really awesome views. This is another example of a cut block on Vancouver Island. Someone getting a little bit creative with their retention. It might look a little bit funny, but this practice is actually quite effective for the natural tree seed regeneration of the forest. So we would still plant that, but we wouldn't have to plant it at as high of a density. And depending on the species, if it's mostly hemlock, for example, that'll just take over and grow. You don't really have to plant. In fact, you'd probably have to thin if you were sort of trying to establish a hemlock site. And so I also had the opportunity to take the Silviculture Accreditation Survey course. So this was held down in the southeast portion of the province, so different ecology than what I'm used to. So as you can see here, there's the grassland ecosystem with the ponderosa pine dominant tree species. So I now work at BC Timber Sales, which is the provincial government's arm of forestry. So I work for the province, and I'm in the silviculture department. So my wheelhouse is planting, surveying, brushing, site preparation, and I'm also trying to get a sheep grazing program off the ground because herbicide is very, very controversial, and BC Timber Sales in Prince George anyways has really, we haven't used it for several years now, and we don't intend to continue using it. But I can't really talk about silviculture and ecology in BC without mentioning our Biogeoclematic Zones. So BEC for short. These zones, they're classified by a whole bunch of different factors, including the dominant vegetation, the tree species, the climate, the terrain, all that sort of stuff, precipitations and temperatures and soil moisture. So basically, again, we're looking at this sort of chunk of the island or of the province. So I'm operating mostly in the subboreal spruce, this light purple, SBS. I also dabble in the Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir, the ESSF. The lime green in here is the interior cedar hemlock, the ICH, one of my favorite ecosystems, so beautiful. And then talking about the caribou, we're down here mostly in the orange, that ponderosa pine, grass, sagebrush ecosystem. So these zones, they start at a large scale, and then they just get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's a real big pain to learn in school, but definitely you use it all the time on the job for sure. So it's one of those things that's actually worth learning. Basically, the zones get broken down to variants, and that's right down to the moss layer. You're really identifying quite a particular set of conditions, and this information is used to dictate what we're going to plant there. So, although BEC is unique to BC, as Matt was mentioning, I'm sure access issues are not unique at all. Winter roads can be a real challenge. To avoid soil compaction, most of the harvesting occurs in the winter. And so when it's springtime and everything melts, sometimes things are less than ideal. In this case, this is a beaver dam flooding a road, and that's also really common. And so we are responsible for blocks to reach free growing, which can take, anywhere from 6 or 8, 10 years, all the way to 20, 25 years, depending on what's going on with the site and what species you're planting. So sometimes we have to survey blocks 20 years after they've been planted, and lots can happen in that time. The roads get grown in, or there's blowdown, as seen in this photo. My good old pal Luke carving the way for us. And sometimes we just have to get really creative and innovative. This is a wooden road. I'm not even sure how this was constructed, but this is a really wet area northeast of Prince George. And yeah, just for road stability, it's basically wooden mats that they put down there. But it's forestry, so anything can happen. Big old lake, or again, on the left, this is an example of a bridge that was installed in the winter, and then it was very impassable in the spring. This drop here was like a couple feet. I was not impressed. My planters were not impressed. And of course, you always got to call for reinforcements at least once a year. Good old stuck in the mud. But never fear, we have lots of alternatives. We take quads out to access areas where trucks can no longer go. You just got to make sure you have adequate supervision. This is my boy Stanley. We also get to take helicopters. This is one of our local guys here, Bailey helicopters. We use them quite frequently. But before we get into the surveys, I mean, it all starts with planting. So what is planted, I think I mentioned, is dictated by the stocking standards. So these are defined in legislation, primarily the Forest Range and Practices Act in BC and its accompanying regulations. The forest stewardship plan for any area, that's going to be written by a forester and it has to be approved by the government. And then there's also seed use regulations that are set by the chief forester. So that's sort of taking into account for changing climates and things like that, which I'm going to get into in a moment. But she's developed some standards for seed use right now, Diane Nichols, and who's the current chief forester in the province. So many sites can support a variety of species, so that's good. A lot of the time we have a few options, but it can get pretty tricky if you only have one or two preferred species or one or two acceptable species. Sometimes it can feel like your hands are a bit tied. So another consideration is the assisted migration idea. So approximately 240 million seedlings are planted every year in BC. And sort of some concern around that is by the time these trees are ready to be harvested again, maybe in 60 or 80 years, the climate and the ecology and things just might look really different in BC. So people are concerned that, okay, we're planting this species here now, but in 50 years, if it's 4 degrees warmer, that tree's not going to survive. So we're trying to base some of this stuff on climatic modeling. And so the photo on the right here of this map, this is a study that's been going on since 2009, I believe. And there's 15 different species and 48 different reforestation sites from California all the way up to the Yukon. And basically what we're looking at here is, how are all these species doing? How are they changing to the climate? What's going on? Can we push these historically southern species up as this area is getting warmer and drier? Some areas in here are getting wetter. So what's going to happen to the species that are adapted to the drier sites? So there's lots of modeling and puzzling and things going on there. And basically this information is being used to guide our stocking regulations and our guidance. And this gentleman on the left, my good pal Darius, he's our fertilizer guy. Fertilizer has come a long way too in the past couple of years, but 5 or 10 years for sure. We used to have to plant fertilizer, so it comes in like little tea bags, and you used to dig a hole for the fertilizer and then dig a hole for the tree. And that's not cool. Planters don't want to do that. So it takes a lot of time and energy and effort. So now we have developed some technology around these fertilizer bags, and the fertilizer granules are coated in a moisture releasing chemical technology. So as it gets wet, it slow releases, which is really cool. So before, when you had to dig 2 separate holes, that's because the fertilizer would release too much too fast and it would just burn the crap out of the trees and kill them. So the opposite effect of what you're trying to do. And so now with this newer technology and these coated granules, you can put the tea bag in the same hole as the tree. And so it's a lot more efficient, and planters are much more happy. And we usually fertilize for several different reasons. Either the site's really dry and crappy and rocky and there's not a lot of nutrients, or it's really, really brushy and we're trying to give those seedlings a leg up. So assisted migration, all this climate modeling, as I mentioned, has led to the development of the climate-based seed transfer. And this has been ongoing from the genetic resources management team, the tree improvement branch, action plan for climate change. There's a lot of big players that are sort of helping facilitate this movement. So here's just a bunch of trees that are being sort of tested. This is from the tree improvement branch. And basically, the climate-based seed transfer is using that modeling to predict future temperatures and then which species are going to be adapted to where. So we're trying to sort of facilitate this migration of species. So these trees are being grown in nurseries and planted across the province in suitable sites. So we'll see what happens. One of these examples is Western larch. So historically, we didn't used to plant a whole lot of it up here, but it has similar growing conditions to Douglas fir. So we've been planting quite a bit more of it throughout the province just to increase that species diversity and have other options as well. But the larch is different in the sense that it's the only conifer that drops its leaves, its needles. And so that does change the acidity of the soil. And it also has a completely different bryophyte colony than other trees. So it's just something to be mindful of when you're planting species that are not endemic or not naturally sort of in these areas. It's just something to be mindful of, like you will change the ecology eventually. And so that's sort of the big ticket question with assisted migration. It's how far do we go with this? How much of the ecology are we going to change? Do we really know what we're doing? Is this model really good? So there's a lot of questions, but it's nice to see that people are researching this and we're trying to plan for the future. So after the trees are planted, a survival survey will occur 1 to 3 years after. We usually aim for the second year, kind of give it a chance to be established, and then we can really see if there's issues like got munched by animals or forest health or just didn't survive or whatnot. So 2 years kind of gives you a good window. And all of our surveys are conducted to the standards of the good old Silviculture Survey Procedures Manual. So that's my Bible. That's that's what that course was teaching me, and this is sort of the standards for the province. And on the right is a nice picture of a healthy pine because I just love seeing healthy pine. It's kind of rare sometimes, some areas. So this is essentially what we're trying to accomplish. This is a well-stocked cut block with little brush competition. And there's not a lot of brush competition because this is a drier site. The species here are, there's Doug fir, there's hybrid spruce, and lodgepole pine. And this block is, I think, about four or 5 years old. And this is from a regeneration survey that I did last year, I think. And here's another photo, a slightly older block, and it's got some nice retention around a small pond. So we've got the aspen and some mature conifers, and we try to visit blocks every 3 years. So after the survival survey, depending on if there's a high brush competition or not, we might visit the site again in 3 or 4 years. But we definitely try to maintain a presence every few years just to make sure everything's still growing and still good. So this is a photo of another kind of classic cut block. This is north of Prince George. And at the top here, you can see some retention. We've got the aspen again and some Doug fir. So these trees are going to act as seed trees and help reforest the rest of the block. We did plant this block because the brush competition is quite high. You can't really leave blocks like this to naturally regenerate without without planting some, because you just won't make your numbers in time, I guess I should say. And here's an example of a really brushy block. This is sort of the type of block I'm targeting for sheep grazing. And in the foreground here, all this leafy lobed vegetation here, this is thimbleberry, Rubus parviflorus. Delicious, but chokes out the crop trees. And so here is another brushy site, but this site is woody stems is the problem, not the herbaceous layer. So this is what trembling aspen looks like when it's sort of coppicing and shooting up. You know, all of these are genetically the same. They're just growing from one big colony underground. And so we would treat this. I prescribed a brushing treatment for this site. So manual brushing. A crew goes out with their brush saws and hacks down all of that, all those little trembling aspen stems there. And because aspen reproduces vegetatively, the coppicing will occur. So out of all those stumps, you know, you'll see a bunch of fresh vegetation coming up. So we can't, well, best management practices state we're not going to have a free growing survey until 3 years after that manual brushing treatment occurs, so we can really see how that vegetation is going to come back. So just to touch on that free growing part, free growing, I don't know if we really want to get into like the nuts and bolts of that sort of legislation in BC, but free growing is basically the point at which you're declaring this block to be free of competition. It's in good forest health, you're meeting your target stocking, and it's going to be free growing into the future too. So that's sort of that key piece with not surveying until you know that vegetation is going to be controlled. So here we are with some alder. This is a really brushy site as well, but I personally try not to target alder for brush maintenance and competition. Alder is a nitrogen fixing tree. It's got a relationship with the Frankia alni bacteria. So little nodules grow on the roots, and that takes nitrogen from the air and fixes it in the ground, in the soil for the trees to use. So it's a really beneficial species for lots of different reasons. I mean, that nitrogen fixation, but also birds love alder. It's good wildlife habitat, good fire breaks, ground cover, all that good stuff. So generally we usually target just the trembling aspen, but in this case I did have to go after some alder because although spruce is planted in here, which is good, it's not gonna pass free growing because you have to have a 1 meter radius of all the crop trees clear of any overtopping vegetation. Okay, so another silviculture practice that's in our toolbox is prescribed burning. So the photo on the right is of a block that had a burn treatment on it. And so you can kind of see like this is fireweed, like these clumps here are fireweed, and normally fireweed looks like this guy here. It can grow 3 meters tall really quickly, way faster than the crop trees. But after a prescribed burn, it comes back as a shrub and it's really low. And that's really interesting to me. And I think it's a really good practice if the conditions are favorable and you have enough resources to carry this out. So we did some prescribed burning a couple of years ago. We didn't do any last year. We're hoping to do some this year, but yeah, we'll see. There's a lot of logistics involved with that, but the BC Wildfire Service is really keen to work with us because it just makes their job easier in the future. So I think a stronger partnership is going to develop over these next coming years. And so the problem with the fireweed growing to be 3 meters is in the winter, it'll just collapse. And like, you know, one stem doesn't look too bad, but when you've got a thick field of fireweed, that vegetation press will completely destroy conifers over several years. They just won't be able to get ahead of it. This is a bog. Here's a very classic example of a BC wetland. We've got quite a few classifications. I'm going to go through them quickly just to give you a little idea. I'm sure it's very similar in other parts of Canada and the States for sure. But this here is a bog, and it's classified that way from its high water table. And these are really tricky to reforest based on that high water table. Basically, the only option is black spruce, Picea mariana, which is one of the most resilient trees in North America. It's actually the national tree of Newfoundland and Labrador. And if it can grow in Newfoundland, it can grow anywhere. Black spruce is also in the taiga forest. It's hybridized with lots of other different spruce. And in BC anyways, the white spruce and the Engelmann spruce have hybridized to the point that we cannot visually tell them apart anymore. They need a genetic analysis to determine what percentage of each species is in there. So we just call it hybrid spruce, and it's got its own code, SX, and we're not trying to tell them apart anymore. So just briefly, our wetland classification. So I was just describing bogs, and they have that high water table, but they're also peat based. So they're like a peat land. And they usually lack nutrients, and mostly their vegetation is pretty sparse. It's mostly sphagnum moss or peat mosses. You got some ericaceous shrubs, and then the black spruce. Fens in this corner, they're also peatlands, but they've got a very slow sort of internal drainage, another high water table, lacking nutrients. But they've got some different species. They also have the black spruce, but also tamarack, sedges, grasses, and a wider variety of mosses. And then on the other side here in the mineral wetlands, so mineral soil and organic usually have more nutrients. So swamps, they're the wetlands where standing or gently moving water is what brings in those nutrients. But they get continuously waterlogged, like something will come in and then it'll stay there for a long time. So it could have lots of different vegetation. Usually swamps have quite a bit of conifers around the outside, and they're a little bit more densely colonized by trees and shrubs, whereas marshes, they're sort of more open. They've got the reeds and the sedges and those types of plants. So they really lack those woody stems. Here's a beautiful example of a cut block that I was responsible for reforesting. So as you can see, we've got a really high water table. It's a hot mess with slash, and there's some sphagnum moss all through here. So I prescribed site preparation. Matt touched on this as well, but basically site prep, we're getting an excavator in here to scoop chunks of that and flip it on its head, and so you have a mound of exposed mineral soil on the top, and that's where the tree is planted. So it'll look different depending on the needs of the site. For this one, we're dealing with water, so you're going to have a mound and then a puddle and then a mound and then a puddle, and so it can be sort of a bit of a nightmare for tree planters and surveyors who come in after. They're usually pretty difficult sites, but we do our best to reforest them to target stocking. Other reasons we do site prep, if it's in a low-lying area and there's a lot of cold air and cold water coming down, that cold air will pond and it'll create frost pockets. And so creating mounds for the trees to be planted on, that'll really help give them a boost out of that cold, frosty air, and will increase their chance of survival. And then finally, if it's a super brushy site, we could site prep that. And so again, the trees have a head start on a little mound to get above the brush. Anybody know who this is? Yeah, of course I can't talk about silviculture in BC without talking about bears and wildlife. So don't tell my mom, but I do see a lot of bears in the woods for sure. Silviculture especially, so cut blocks, they really open up the land and create really good habitat for these pioneer species such as blueberry or vaccinium. And with the blueberries come the bears. There's one there. Your classic black bear, Ursus Americanus. It has several subspecies actually. One of the most famous subspecies is the Ursus Americanus kermodii, the Kermode bear or the spirit bear. So it's got a recessive gene that turns the bear white. So usually found the central or north coast of mainland BC, really small population carrying that recessive gene. But there's like 4 or 5 different subspecies of black bear, all with different coloring. Cinnamon and brown and black. So lots of different bears there. And that Kermode bear was named after Francis Kermode, and he was the director, I think, at the Royal BC Museum. And so he was the first one to sort of document the bear, the white bear. So it was named after him. I won't say he discovered it. He certainly did not, but he properly documented it. So I also pay attention to ungulates for browse purposes. So the photo on the left here is a Douglas fir that's been munched pretty hard by our good old friend the moose. Photo on the right, Alces. And moose also love balsam fir too, so sometimes we'll get really stunted trees, but usually they grow back. They're just sort of shrubs instead. They're just doing some pruning for us. So forest health, this is a huge player in my line of work. The interior of BC, we get hammered with quite a lot of forest health issues. In particular, in the Amanika, the Commandra blister rust is shown here. This can have severe impacts on lodgepole pine. So Commandra is dependent on having plant species with its alternate hosts available. So bastard toadflax, that's the one that alternates with Commandra blister rust. And if our local research has sort of indicated that proximity has a lot to do with how this rust will spread throughout the stand. And it's really hard to treat it apart from trying to eradicate it by pruning or spraying herbicide on the alternate host species. Like it's just a very difficult thing to contain because the spores are so small and they spread through wind and rain, and brushing can really amplify the spread of rust in a stand. So there's lots to consider when you're trying to deal with things like this. So here, scarlet paintbrush, Castilla, that's the alternate host for the white pine blister rust or the 5 pine blister rust, also stalactiform blister rust. Ribes here in the center, that's also an alternate host for some rust species. Yeah, it just helps with the rust life cycle there. And then this is the bastard toadflax in the corner here. So when I see that, it's bad news. And here's just a photo of the life cycle. Generally, it's got a 3 to 5 year life cycle. So it's really long lived, and it bounces between the host tree and then these alternate host species. So it's got like two things going on here. It's got its continuous just spreading spores, and then it's colonizing again on these alternate hosts. And basically, if the rust is on the stem, like shown here, the canker will get bigger and bigger until it eventually girdles the tree and kills it. So this is a photo of the stalactiform blister rust, and it differs from the commandra. It's a long, sort of narrow canker, whereas the commandra can be sort of more spherical. And apparently the number of years it takes for the fungus to girdle the main stem equals twice its diameter. So that's sort of just like a little, I don't know, a little trick we use in the field. If you see a canker, okay, how many years do I have until it's going to kill this tree? And usually, because it affects young stands, it's not very many years. But wait, there's more. There's a third type of rust that we have to deal with in BC. On the right here, you can see a gall rust on the stem of this tree. And the gall rusts are unique because they can transfer from pine to pine. They don't need an alternate host. They're just doing their own thing. So that's great. Okay, and this is an example of a stand that if you weren't right in it, it might look like it was healthy. So you can see all the green needles at the top, but then down in here, we're getting red, and you can't really see any rust sign at the moment, but basically all these trees are gonna die. It's really difficult once it gets into a thick stand like this to control it. And so I believe we are going to be fill planting this block in the future. So yeah, basically rust will fully express itself at the age of 15. So when the trees are 15 years old. So if you can get a block to year 15, whatever has survived will continue surviving, likely. So yeah, the rust is really, it's difficult to manage in those younger stands. Like if you have an outbreak, you know, I consider anything over 40%, like that's bad news. We're probably gonna have to fill plant if I catch it at age 6. So yeah, it's definitely one of the biggest threats in this area to young stands. And to mature stands though, I'd say one of the biggest threats are bark beetles. So this is an example of a massive cut block northwest of Prince George, and it's a mountain pine beetle block. So you can see all the dead pine in the back. And Matt mentioned the close to nature approach. We do a similar thing in BC. We call it mimicking the natural disturbance regime. And so basically, because lodgepole pine regenerates through fire and these like large scale disturbances, we've come in and logged really big areas to try and eradicate the mountain pine beetle, but also to try and mimic that natural disturbance that pine grows in. However, there are some big differences. Like if a fire ripped through here, you'd have all the cones opening up because they're serotinous and they need that fire to open. You'd also have a lot of nitrogen being deposited into the soil as the charcoal is formed and things burn. And you'd also have some brush control too. It would really suppress all that brush. So we can call it mimicking nature, but there's definitely some differences between a big fire and just harvesting a lot in the name of mimicking a natural disturbance. But anyways, that's also for another day. This block is a Forest for Tomorrow block, and Forest for Tomorrow, that program was started in 2005 to help alleviate the damage done by the mountain pine beetle epidemic and wildfires in BC. It was also kind of created to try and create some opportunity for economic development throughout BC. So taking this damaged wood and salvaging it and still selling it. So we had a pretty short window for doing that. And so that's why production ramped up so much. And now we're starting to see it fall off. So licensees can apply for funding through FFT. and they will fund you to the point of where you were at before the disturbance. So if you had a free growing block or an almost free growing block, so the trees would be, 10 or 12 years old, FFT will fund you for more planting and surveys and brushing and the whole 9 yards to get you back to that point. So it's a pretty cool program. But I'm not going to get into mountain pine beetle because we've been talking about it since the 80s. This guy, on the other hand, this is the spruce beetle, and this is on the rise in BC, especially northern BC. This bark beetle is native to this area, and it destroys mature spruce forests. It consumes, like any other bark beetle, it eats its way through the bark and starts eating all the phloem, all the sap in there, and then it'll lay its eggs, and the larva will hatch, and it'll eat all the sap as well and basically girdle the tree. Historically, this pest had a 1 to 3 year life cycle, but because of recent climatic conditions, it's much warmer. It's been a 1 year life cycle, and they can have multiple flights a year. So that's the major concern, is that we're not having 2 or 3 weeks of -40 to kill off the spruce beetle. So as these temperatures are rising, we're seeing more and more disturbances and more epidemic conditions. So stay tuned for the old spruce beetle. This is sort of the classic damage on a hybrid spruce tree. So you can see all the pitch tubes, and this is a big old ball of frass, which is basically poo and wood shavings and sap and pitch. So you can, there are some management techniques for sure. Salvage harvesting, which is single tree or group tree selection. So you're kind of going in and you're getting the infested trees and you're pulling them out. There's sanitation harvesting, which is you're just clearing the whole thing, and you have to burn stuff to eradicate the spruce beetle, because if you leave trees that are damaged, or you damage trees, or you don't get rid of all of that material, the spruce beetles are attracted to trees in distress. So if you leave a stressed out tree, you're going to attract the very thing you're trying to get rid of. So that's been something that's been really challenging amongst all the different folks who have cutting permits and licenses and tenures and all of that. It's been really difficult to try and streamline what our practices are across the province to deal with this. You can also use trap trees as well, using pheromones. That's been a really interesting one. But again, you have to remember to go back and get those trees and destroy them. So not only bark beetles, but we also have little weevils, which are just the funniest, cutest little things, their little noses. Several different kinds. We have the white pine weevil, which is actually on spruce. We have the Warren root collar weevil, and that one girdles the base of the tree just underneath the soil. And then there's the lodgepole pine terminal weevil, which kind of looks like this. It can completely destroy the tops of pine and spruce, and it digs little holes, as seen in that photo there, and just eats the inside. So this pest, it might not be, as catastrophic as some of the others, but it can definitely have a pretty heavy impact on stands if it could stunt the growth. Oftentimes trees will produce a new fresh leader to come up and try and overcome that. But yeah, it can make for a pretty unhealthy stand, because these holes and this damage just makes it more susceptible to other things too. So trees are pretty resilient, but you hammer it with like 2-3 things, it's not gonna make out too well. Okay, another forest health issue that we deal with in BC. This is our Malaria Root Rot, which is a type of white root rot. it's more common in the southern parts of BC, but it's definitely everywhere. It's all over the world. It's in Canada, the States, Asia, Europe, Australia. Armillaria is actually really quite interesting, I think. It's a really long-lived species, and it's one of the largest organisms in the world. I think in the States, maybe they have a huge Armillaria colony, and it's like, I think it's classified as like the biggest living thing in the world because it's all genetically the same, and it's just this like massive thing growing underground. Pretty crazy. So anyways, there are hundreds of different trees and shrubs that are susceptible to Armillaria, and it's really tricksy to manage. As you can see by this diagram of the life cycle, if we harvest a stand that has Armillaria in it, as soon as you cut those trees down, there's no defense. Like, the tree is constantly putting energy into defending itself against all of these things. And so if you cut that down, there's no more defenses, and the Armillaria can completely run rampant and go nuts. So because it's so slow, it hasn't really been that high of a concern, but we're finding that going back to regenerate these stands is really, really challenging. And if you ever come across something in the forest where it's just this opening and there's no sort of defined feature, like it's not a seepage or it's not super wet or something, and there's some dead trees around the edges, like you might be standing in a root rot center and nothing's growing there because you've got Armillaria underneath colonizing everything, and yeah, it can be really, really challenging. So I think this is going to be more on the radar and managed for. One of my first forestry jobs was I was a field and lab tech for a master's student who was doing his project on Armillaria, and he had a bunch of different sites throughout BC, and we were going and collecting data in the field. And yeah, it was really interesting to see sort of how this disease spreads and how it works. And he was looking at what happens if we remove those stumps. But that practice is, as like Matt mentioned, it's really hard on equipment. It's really hard on the soil. It's hard on the ground. You're basically turning that area into a parking lot and then trying to reforest it. So you might deal with the Armillaria, maybe, probably not, but then you're also dealing with all this soil compaction from having excavators ripping out stumps, and like you have to take every part out. You can see all this white fan, all these mycelium, like they grow so deep. So it's going to be really interesting to see our creative ways for dealing with this disease. And to our knowledge, there's only 2 species that are not susceptible to Armillaria, and that is larch and birch. So if anyone's going to win, it's going to be them. Okay, and of course, I can't talk about silviculture in BC without talking about wildfires too. It's such a huge reason why we reforest. A huge driver of our reforestation efforts in BC is wildfires. And again, a lot of them are those FFT blocks, so folks can get funding for reforesting. One area that I'm responsible for is the beautiful Robson Valley. So this chunk right here on the edge, this was the ICH area, that lime green Beck zone. So interior cedar hemlock. So we've got a real diversity of species, which is something I really enjoy about that area. You've got cedar and hemlock and spruce and lots of different species out there. So in 2018, wildfires completely raged through this area. I mean, this is the Hugh Allen drainage here, and there's 10,000 hectares burned in this area alone. So really catastrophic in 2018. So here we are trying to reforest this area. And this is sort of what it looks like. A lot of dead standing trees and a lot of rocks. Oh, my wrists hurt just thinking about it. So here are some happy trees. We've got a happy little spruce tree on the left that was planted in a burn site. You can see that charred earth there and very little brush competition, and it's dry. And then on the right, that's a little cedar tree that's planted in there, and that was right in the river valley bottom. So quite a bit of area on either side of the river that runs through that drainage didn't get burned, so that was nice. So we'll have hopefully some establishment down there. However, there are still threats after a recently burned site. This beautiful creature here is the black army cutworm. This guy feeds on vegetation that sprouts up after fires. So as you can see, he's here munching on a fireweed, and there's also grasses and things. Any green vegetation, this little thing is going to be munching. And when all of that vegetation is gone, or if there were none already, it's going to eat the planted crop trees. So this defoliation can be really aggressive. These are photos from the Robson Valley last year. So we planted it in 2020, and then about a few weeks later, the planting supervisor emailed me and was like, Liz, I don't know what's going on. Like, I went back to check the trees, and like all the needles are gone. Like, we don't know what's going on. And so we went out and had a look, and yeah, it's our good old friend, the black army cutworm. So if defoliation occurs less than 60%, the tree is likely to rebound. Like I said, they're so resilient. Even these delicate little seedlings, they're quite resilient. And if it has enough to bud, it should be okay. But as you can see on the right, I don't know, it's got one, but I'm not holding my breath for that one. So there are some management practices for black army cutworm as well. Basically, if you don't do an assessment prior to planting, it's just a risk that you are taking. But you can do a bit of an assessment prior to planting. You can set up pheromone traps and count the moths in your little container and try and get an idea of what the damage would be. And you can delay planting as well. If you delay planting 1 or 2 years, it should be okay. However, the fires were in 2018, we planted in 2020, and they got decimated. So, you know, things don't always play by the rules that we think that they should, or that, you know, research shows us. So definitely doing some due diligence and assessing what the risk will be before you invest a lot of time and money and seedlings and people into planting these really challenging areas. So guys, I mean, I could talk about silviculture all day. There's so much to cover. You know, I have a huge forest health book that I take with me to the field. I only touched on like 3 or 4 things. Oh, I forgot to show you. This is an example of a gall rust. My office is just covered in pieces of trees. But anyways, yeah, I mean, I could talk about forestry all day. It's definitely as diverse up here as the ecosystems are. And I hope this has given you a little bit of a taste of what we do. If you're interested, there's so much work. Come on up anytime. We've got silviculture surveys, forest development, forest health, and beetle probing. There's tree planting, there's firefighting, whatever your little heart desires, we probably have it on the go up here. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'm definitely here to answer any questions you have now or in the future. Get a hold of me anytime. Thank you.
Great, thanks a lot, Liz. Once again, a great presentation.
No problem.
It looks like you guys have a lot of challenges with. I mean, I guess we all do, but it seems like yeah, you've got a lot of bugs. Maybe that's just me, but it's quite impressive.
Yeah, for sure, lots of bugs. In some parts of the province are easier than others, but yeah, up here it's yeah, it's super challenging. Like when I was doing forestry on the coast, it was like, ooh, elk is a big deal. I'm like, that's it? Elk and some root rot? Wow, must be nice.
Right. Yeah, and talking about those big mammals, I had in mind an issue we have here in Quebec where caribou is like falling victim to wolves and bears that are attracted just like you mentioned by our silvicultural practices. So, and I believe you guys also have some reindeer or caribou. I'm not sure what the proper term is. Um, but yeah, I believe you have those animals up there. So are they as much of an issue as it is in the eastern part of the country?
Yeah, we for sure have caribou, and we do in my operating area, actually northeast of Prince George, the Kennedy siding, like out past Mackenzie. There are caribou. It doesn't impact me and my work. It's more for folks on the timber development and planning side. So dealing with ungulate winter ranges and government action regulations, and yeah, there's a lot of planning that goes in to caribou. They eat lichen, like they're not really out there eating my crop trees. So I mean, I don't really have to deal with them at all, but it's more so the broader forestry picture having to incorporate that value into the planning process and making sure we have enough space for them. It's crazy out in Kennedy siding, they have feeding stations and they're just along this super busy FSR. There's like lots of forestry, there's other industries out there, there's CN Railroad, and they're just like sitting there like munching their feed on the side of an FSR. It's really pretty crazy, but yeah, they are resilient too, as long as they have enough food. And so that's the part in forestry that sucks for them, is we eliminate a lot of those mature forests with the lichen that they eat.
Yeah, I see. Very interesting. Did anybody have any more questions?
I just wanted to say thank you, Liz, for taking time out of your Easter weekend to give presentations yesterday and today. They were both really interesting. And I've wondered myself about the close to nature silviculture practices in BC, where they mimic the natural disturbance patterns. And to me, it almost seems like backwards logic, because there's huge areas that are impacted by wildfires and by bark beetle. And then to throw on top of that cut blocks that are like hundreds of hectares in size that are supposed to mimic that really don't, because there's not the same release in nutrients in a lot of these small dynamics. And it seems to me that like the logical way to do it would be to harvest in a way that really doesn't mimic those natural disturbances and kind of creates a bit more resilience. I know that's a huge topic, but I've always kind of been confused about why it is that they want to try to mimic it when it doesn't really.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It is a kind of tricksy topic, and it sounds like it's a good idea. It sounds like on the sort of coattails of ecosystem management. But just like you mentioned, there are differences. You're not getting that nutrient input. You're not getting the regeneration of species that are adapted to fire. They need that fire to release. So I think there are a lot of differences, and I think we're going to see, it's so hard because we have these ideas, we implement them on the land, and then we don't know what's going to happen until 20 years later, 50 years later, when we're like, oh, that didn't really work out, or like, oh, yeah, that's not so bad. So you don't really know, we're making decisions now, and we might not see the results of them even within our own careers. So it is really, really tricky to navigate. I think some of the natural disturbance mimics might work a little bit better, like the small gap dynamics of root rot on the coast. That's fine. But when you're talking like a 600 hectare cut block to mimic fire, I'm like, that's a lot less fine. So yeah, I think it is something that's going to need more robust research, because I don't really think we know what the outcomes of that is going to be yet.
Yeah. especially as it seems that the extent of the wildfire seasons and the bark beetle epidemics are related to the way that forestry has modified the landscape and allowed for that connectivity for those problems to get to the scale they're at. So hopefully in the future there's research that allows for things to change.
For sure. Yeah, I would definitely like to see more partial cutting and shelterwood systems in BC. It's much more common down south and, in the East Kootenays and the Vancouver Island, and it's much more common down there. And I think there's just more, several reasons, ecology, but also I think there's a lot more public pressure and there's more people who are watching and seeing and impacted. So I think as things continue and as there's more pressure to find timber, I hope that we become a little bit more innovative. Like, these are all really old ideas and we just don't implement them. It's like sheep grazing, right? It's such an old thing that was so common and it's not as much anymore. And so, I think we're going to see a bit of a shift and a bit of a return to some of these older ideas that perhaps are a bit more costly up front, but they're definitely going to save your bacon on the silviculture end of things. Like, I spend so much money on silviculture and it doesn't seem like it's a big consideration up front. But again, as Matt was mentioning, for loggers in particular, it's not a huge money-making industry. So I think it really has to come down to governments and incentives and just other initiatives to try and facilitate better forest stewardship and better practices.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. It's maybe I can add on to that, because in Quebec we've had lots of effort to diminish the area of our toll cutting areas. Like, instead of doing, as you said, like great areas of just cutting the whole thing, having either partial cuts or smaller operation sectors. But the consequences of that have been that by keeping up with the demand, so removing the same amount of wood, we ended up creating much more forest roads. So it's that's another issue, because those roads, of course, don't regenerate, or it's so compact that it's really hard to implement vegetation on top of them. So, not saying that one is better than the other. It's just that it's such a complicated topic, and I mean, we could go on for days talking about it. So definitely interesting. And I mean, another reason to keep our eyes open on what's being done elsewhere in the country, because it, of course, prevents us from sometimes making the mistakes that others have made. And anyway, just some food for thought. Did anyone have any other questions? Maybe I can stop the recording.